Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 31st meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. I'd like to welcome Sarah Boyatt this morning, who will be substituting for Monica Lennon, who's unable to attend. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 6 and 7 in private. Item 6 is consideration of the evidence heard on the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Bill, Legislative Consent Memorandum, and item 7 is consideration of the committee's work programme. Are we all agreed to take items 6 and 7 in private? We are agreed. Our second item of business is consideration of the Legislative Consent Memorandum on the UK Government's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Bill. The committee took evidence on this at its meeting on the 30th September, and it's agreed that further evidence would support our consideration. As a brief reminder, a legislative consent memorandum is laid when a UK bill provision is in the areas within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, or alters that competence or the executive competence of the Scottish Government. The committee must report to the Parliament on whether its consent should be granted. It is also taking the opportunity to look more broadly at the prospect of sustainable aviation fuel production in Scotland and its potential role in reducing greenhouse gases from aviation. This will feed into our work later this year when we consider transport aspects of the forthcoming Scottish Government's climate change plan. The bill itself aims to create a more stable pricing for sustainable aviation fuel to encourage domestic production to grow. This is in parallel with increasing the mandate for use of SAF by the industry. The Scottish Government supports the bill overall, but is withholding its consent for now on some technical matters. And I was to say, hopefully we'll see a supplementary LCM soon, but we received that at 7 o'clock last night, so we have that, and I believe there will be another one forthcoming shortly. So I'm going to welcome to the meeting Simon McNamara, the Head of Government and Corporate Affairs for Loganair, Doug McKieran, the co-founder and Chief Technical Officer for Zero. I think you were Zero Petroleum, was it Zero?
Yeah, I think we still are Zero Petroleum, but we tend to Zero's easier.
Oh, more snappy title now with Zero,
exactly.
So whichever one it is. And we've got Ralph Lavery, Net Zero Applications and Engineer for Catagen. Thank you all for attending this morning to this briefing session. And I'm going to move straight on to questions, and I'm going to start the questions. In the LCM, the Scottish Government says it supports the bill because it could help create and sustain a SAF sector. I'm going to just put on record, SAF is sustainable aviation fuel, and I'm not going to repeat that. I don't like TLAs, but that's where we are. So in your view, are the UK and Scotland well positioned as a potential leaders in the prospective SAF industry? It's important to have a SAF industry distributed around the UK, isn't it? A rhetorical question. Who'd like to go first? By the way, if you all look away when I ask who'd like to go first, I will just go to the person who looks away last. And that, in this case, was you, Doug. So I'm coming to you first, then I'll go to Simon, and then I'll go to Ralph.
I think that Scotland's actually positioned very well to help with the kick-starting of the SAF industry, particularly around the power-to-liquid sector. I think that Scotland, with its offshore wind, has a very skilled workforce there. We've already been working with EPC companies in Aberdeen to scale up. There's a good skilled workforce there, and they can also help scale up. The synergies between power-to-liquids and oil and gas are indistinguishable. We've used the same process engineers, the same piping engineers, etc., to develop our scale-up plans. They also have indicated to us that if we wanted to scale up and we got the investment that we wanted, there are sites all the way down the east coast of Scotland that would be suitable for this. The company we were working with actually has sites earmarked for this. And I also think that Scotland has already demonstrated its global leader. It's a global leader in offshore wind, in the installation of those wind turbines offshore. And I think that the power-to-liquid market, Scotland could and has the most to gain from kick-starting this. And the reason I say this is because I think that the power to liquids is the only truly scalable solution to net zero and all the government mandates that are made. There is only enough feedstock for power to liquids to meet the SAF requirement. And Scotland has already, and there's many documents on this, a lot of curtailment of the offshore wind. I think Montel have already done a study on 2025 for the first half of the year, and 4 terawatts was curtailed. And if you double that for this year, then you could actually meet the SAF mandate for 2030 with that energy. So hopefully that puts it in perspective, that the challenge really isn't the energy generation, it's actually the energy storage and the transportation of that energy to the consumer. And Scotland has all the makings of being able to do this. Grangemouth and the pipelines down the East Coast, to get energy from offshore to the customer, the cheapest form of doing that is in a pipeline, and that needs to be power to liquids. So my point to everybody here today will be, I hope that you don't think that power to liquids is very expensive, because that's always what I hear. Yet we are wasting an enormous amount of energy on a daily basis, which could be power to liquid. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. Simon, SAF important to you at Loganair, and do you see a future for it for you?
So I think there's kind of two questions in there. There's the first on is Scotland well positioned to be a leader in SAF? I think it's well positioned. The question is, can it execute on it? And I think that's the really key question. I think everything Doug has said I would agree with, but what we do know now is SAF is in short supply. And that's not just in Scotland, not just in the UK, it's globally. And we need SAF. The airline industry as a whole needs SAF to comply with the targets it set itself to hit net zero by 2050. So for Loganair, it is very important, which is why we are interested in, for example, the revenue certainty mechanism and the contents of this bill in terms of how it delivers the SAF and the production plants, the transportation, all of those issues. I think the one second bit for Loganair, which I think was partly in your question, is there is a discussion around new technology as an alternative to SAP. That is alternative propulsion systems, alternative energy sources in aircraft. And that will happen first in the regional sector in small aircraft. So for us at Loganair, there is a lot of potential there, and maybe we will come on to it later, of some of the new technologies that are in the pipeline that would be suitable for the network that we fly, relatively short routes, relatively small aircraft. And so Scotland and Loganair could absolutely be a pioneer in new technology as well.
Thank you. Ralph, I noticed you nodding at various stages during that, and now's your chance to say whether you agree or not.
Yes, thank you for the invite as well. I would definitely agree with the other two witnesses, particularly Doug. I think Scotland is incredibly well positioned to generate the hydrogen and the sustainable carbon that's needed to make sustainable molecules. I think that's been demonstrated through projects like ScotWind, INTOG, even Zero Zone projects through the Advanced Fuels Fund in Orkney. And we have our own projects in Scotland as well in Orkney. The key thing for us is we see the opportunity and the potential for Scotland to be a SAF leading region on a global stage, not just on a UK stage. But as was just discussed, we're very keen to see the details of the SAF bill and how that could benefit the Scottish industry economy and the existing manufacturing bases and skills in Scotland in particular. We think there's a lot of crossover with oil and gas and the advanced manufacturing sectors that are already present.
Okay, Doug, you mentioned Grangemouth, and we've been looking at Project Willow and what effect that would have, and whether there's a big position, or Grangemouth is perfectly positioned for SAF production. Do you want to just build a little bit on what you said in relation to that?
Yes, I mean, the studies that we've looked at have been very sort of high level, let's say, and looking at very large numbers. But for me, it's about using existing infrastructure, and that's quite key to actually getting investors to come to the table is to de-risk and to take as much of the capex out of those projects as possible. There are other sites that we've looked at. There is one up in the Orkneys called Flotter. I was there a couple of years ago. That was a site that was doing 400,000 barrels a day, and I think now does around 40, and that will get decommissioned. That's out in the North Sea. That's another brownfield site that could be converted as a terminal there, and you could use all the existing infrastructure. So the comment is really about reutilising existing facilities and workforces without having major relocation. That was really where I was coming from.
So your view is that Grangemouth is not limited, SAF production wouldn't just be limited to Grangemouth around in Scotland. There are other sites that we could use.
There are other sites as well. I was talking to an MP. We get various MPs coming to our technology centre in Bicester. And I think one of the things that really does need to be done is there needs to be a proper evaluation in the UK of how we transition, if we were to, with the lens of power to liquids, where are the sites in the UK most appropriate for us to get our first plants built? And he's putting that in as a recommendation as part of this SAF bill, that there is an additional work done to identify these sites. We evaluated 6 sites in the UK as part of our AFF funding, and they were suitable, but it doesn't mean that they were ideal. We're a very small company. We can't do a thorough survey, but yeah.
I mean, I think we all accept, well, I believe anyway, that demand will probably direct where production is made and getting as close to where the demand is. Simon, just a question really for you, which I guess anyone can come back on, is power to liquids, which we've heard is the long-term prospect and the long-term objective. When would you think it will be making a meaningful contribution to air travel in the UK? And I know you're going to say, well, we're already starting. Yeah. I'm expecting that. But when do you think others will be following Loganair's lead, if that's the right expression?
On the SAF side, or
yes.
the technology, yeah. So I think obviously there is a SAF mandate, so we are complying, and the industry is obliged to. But obviously those are the first steps, and the industry has set itself a stronger target to get to net zero by 2050, and we've set ourselves in Loganair a target by 2040. So that will need more SAF than the mandates require us to do. So we would like to see this fuel coming online as soon as possible. The other half of that is the affordability of it, and I think maybe we will come on to that, because that is a factor, obviously, for third-generation fuels. Doug says it won't be expensive. I'm not sure I 100% agree, but if we can solve the transportation problems and the loss of energy wastage, then perhaps. But that's our biggest concern. If you speak at industry, if you listen to industry statistics, they're talking about SAF between being 3 and 5 times more expensive than existing jet fuel prices. Part of that is because the supply of it is in short supply, so supply and demand means higher prices. So if you can solve that, the price will come down. But we have to bear that affordability factor in mind, because people need to travel, and in Scotland in particular, that's very important for island connectivity, and they need to be able to travel at an affordable rate. So at the moment, for the SAF that we are incorporating into our tanks, it's around 3 times the price of conventional fuel, and we're happy to take that, but it will flow through to prices, and I think that's a balance to be struck. So whatever we can do to drive up volume will help drive down the price, which helps everybody as well, and it will increase uptake. I think the final point I would make is your point about where is the biggest demand. Without doubt, in the UK, the biggest demand is further south. There's a big southeast centricity in the UK, whether we like it or not. For Loganair, we're a really important provider here in Scotland, but we're a small airline, a relatively small user of SAF. So the centre of gravity is more south, and I think it's important to drag it further north as well and show the importance of Scotland, particularly for air connectivity, because Scotland is absolutely reliant. I think the statistic we have is that I think 70% of our flights are over water. So with the exception of ferries, there is no alternative, whereas if you're taking a domestic flight or another flight, there is alternatives. So I think, yeah, driving up investment to drive up volumes we will take it as soon as it's there. Affordability is key.
Ralph, do you want to come back on that? I mean, I think I'd be interested to hear your views on when it comes to price and the price restrictions that it places on SAF. I mean, it's one of the issues that we've heard, I guess, with hydrogen is the cost of hydrogen. It prevents its its use by many people, and I'd be interested to know whether you think that it's up to regulation to say more's got to be used, which will drive the price down, or whether how you stimulate price reductions. Ralph?
Yes, so there's probably two aspects I think are very important when we talk about the price of new energy vectors like hydrogen and sustainable fuels. One of them is new technologies to make them. Conventional production of fuel has been very centralized, very large scale, and focused on economies of scale using incumbent technology. We're starting to see a shift away from that, and new technologies have an opportunity to innovate rapidly and massively reduce the costs to produce fuels from them, like Zero's technology and ourselves. We're seeing more distributed, closer to primary generation solutions coming to market. And that means that your electron essentially can be captured closer to where it's generated. And that reduces costs of transmission of that electricity to centralized location. The other key aspect of that is the capital investment required to make those vectors become smaller, because the plant size is smaller and more distributed, which speaks to Simon's point around the focus of the southeast region of the UK. If you have distributed fuel production across the United Kingdom, you will have a more equal economic opportunity, which is something very important to ourselves being based in Northern Ireland, which sometimes gets excluded from some of these conversations on a UK level. But the second point for me is that there is an understanding that sustainable fuels are more expensive. At the moment, what we're seeing as examples are things like the shipping industry in Europe, which recently was incorporated into the EU ETS, which effectively doubled the price of conventional fossil fuels in that industry. And how they're managing that is through kind of a combination of policy and supportive economic vehicles like the IMO's universal carbon price. We think something similar will happen in the aviation sector through bodies like IATA and through the CORSIA arrangement, or CORSIA, depending on your pronunciation of that specific acronym. And we think there's not really one solution to that, but the combination of new technology and the cost down curve that comes with that, as opposed to small iterative changes that we're seeing at conventional refinery technology, will be a big part to play in that, and being able to access energy where it's generated or close to where it's generated, reducing things like constraint payments, curtailment costs for that electricity, which brings the inputs down in price, which is a key aspect. Ultimately, all of these can be drawn back to renewable electricity. So if you bring the price of your renewable electricity down, the cost of the fuel you produce with it will be less by extension. So that's a really key part of what we're trying to do with our technology.
Okay, thank you. Bob, I think you've got some questions now.
Yeah. So we'll try to get my head around this and how we can better understand this as a committee. So will power to liquid or third generation SAF can require CO2 feedstock. So we'd want to know how we secure that CO feedstock in sufficient quantities. So what are the best sources currently, but will those change for the longer term as we need greater supply? So that would be quite good to know what the challenges may be around that. Doug, could you maybe come in?
Yeah, sure. I think that the pathway on that is for probably the first 6 or 7 plants, I think there's plenty enough CO2 with distilleries and agri-waste CO2. They're very pure feedstocks, so they could be used. And that would be enough for the next 3 to 4 years, 5 years production, and would easily meet the 0.5% mandate at 2030. But after that, we really need some of the direct air capture technologies to start coming online. And I think that that's a realistic timeline for the direct air capture technologies. for them to be scaling up over that period of time. So then you really do need point source and CO2 capture and direct air capture to be coming in 2030 onwards.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Ralph the same question. Before I go to Ralph, Doug, can I just check? You're confident then that those new technologies are developing will be good to go by 2030 and beyond to bring the next target in sight?
Is that to me or to
yourself? Then we ask Ralph to kind of reply to that as well. But
yeah.
you've mentioned that you think that's suitable time for those new technologies to be sufficient. What
yeah,
is
and the
that
UK
based on? What do you get?
Yeah, so the UK. So we work quite closely with. We've got a large OEM company that we're working with. Believe it, they're actually one of the world's largest automotive manufacturers, and they're very keen on the direct air capture technology. They're actually planning on bringing one of their units to our facility in Q3, Q4 next year. There is also one of the major airlines is also very big in direct air capture, and they are scaling up their capabilities in that area. And also there are some quite unique startup companies, which when I say startups, probably a bit rude, they've been going for 4 or 5 years now, and they've attracted quite a bit of funding from the UK government. So there's very, very large corporations and some new startup, well, some small companies that are building.
So that's helpful. Area. It wasn't a gut feeling that it would be sufficient. You've got direct business experience that this is developing.
Yeah, absolutely, okay. and is at serious scale,
yes.
As in like one of the plants is doing, if I get this right, is doing thousands of tons a day.
Which is really helpful for putting on the record. So thank you for that. That's why I wanted to kind of follow up on that. Really helpful. Ralph, do you want to add anything to what you've heard?
Positioned as a region than most others when it comes to CO2 supply for sustainable fuels. Doug's already mentioned distilleries as being a very large source of sustainable carbon molecules, the large agri and forestry sinks of carbon that exist and how they're managed will be important, and that speaks to how the bioenergy policy develops in Scotland and how it can recognise SAF. But also projects like Acorn mean that Scotland has the experience of movement and use of CO2 in the region, which will be really important at actually transporting carbon or CO2 to where it's needed to make these fuels. In terms of the quantity of carbon, I would agree with Doug. I don't think we're overly concerned. We've looked at the island of Ireland as well as a similar economy and a similar region in terms of its carbon potential, and we see lots of opportunity to capture CO2 and change that into sustainable fuel molecules. In particular, we think the development of DAC is a really important part of that, or direct air capture. And we're working with several companies that have been part of the UK's Department of Energy Security and Net Zero programs around that to look at how we can work with them and their new technologies. And I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think the development of these new technologies in the UK is strategically important for supply of CO2.
No, thanks for reinforcing that. I will come to you, Simon. I want to explore this a wee bit further first. So that's one way we get power to liquid SAF. There's also, and I'm treading carefully because my knowledge base is pretty low, Ralph, so you can help me out here, that low carbon hydrogen feedstock can also be used for the production of SAF. So how should that sector develop? We've heard there's confidence in the CO2 feedstock. How should that sector develop? Where should production be sited as it does develop? And it is important, see a little bit more about transportation of hydrogen, because that's something this committee has asked about previously, and there's challenges in relation to that. So could you say a little bit more about that, Ralph? That'd be helpful.
Yeah, so we develop our own hydrogen and production technologies, and we're seeing more and more the shift to use of hydrogen at point of creation. So rather than transporting hydrogen, which is a very difficult molecule to manage and make behave, and production of that close to where you consume it works best. And that means that where we're primarily seeing demand growing is in heavy industry, so steel, cement, glass manufacture. But also we think that the SAF space becomes very important for the hydrogen economy because it provides a very large demand case for sustainable hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen.
Okay, and can you say a little bit more about that? So I asked where should production be sited? You say you're doing it directly in relation to SAF. How does that work? So where do these sites go for the production, and how does that feed directly into, well, Simon's here in relation to wanting to use that for his fleet of aircraft. So how does that co-location and production feed in?
Yeah, so there's two different models we see emerging in terms of hydrogen production in relation to SAF. More widely, we think hydrogen should be made close to where it's used. So if you're using it in transport applications, say for a bus network, we think that hydrogen production has to be close to where you're refueling the bus fleet. For SAF specifically, if you have technology that allows you to generate it close to renewable sites, then your hydrogen needs to be co-located with that. And that's where the PTL sector becomes really important. But for people like Simon, they ultimately need a finished fuel or a blended fuel. And that means that fuel needs to go through some form of centralized processing facility. Grangemouth was mentioned earlier. That's a good example of those kind of locations, and they seem to us as sensible first locations for hydrogen production capability.
Okay, thank you. And Doug, I'm going to bring you in, but I'll ask my final question at the same time. A thread through this is that a lot of this generation is very electricity intensive. The UK industrialists get some of the highest electricity costs globally. How can the sector drive down electricity costs? It must feed in quite directly to the overall cost of production of SAF. So any reflections on what Ralph has said, but also how can we get on top of these rising electricity prices which might hamper the development of this market?
Absolutely. So I think one of the problems we've got with energy generation per se is that it involves three major parts of the process. There's the generation of it, then there's the storage of it, and then there's the transmission or transportation of it. And that actually represents the entire cost of energy. And how we get it from point of generation to the consumer, that's the total cost. And this is where power to liquids are a solution to this, because you need to bring in all parts to understand the cost of energy. And so if, as we've got a good example here, the wind turbines and the curtailment, if where those landfall sites, there was a brownfield site not too far away, which we've had a look at, and there are, where that cable comes in, then you co-locate hydrogen and a power to liquids plant, and then you use the existing infrastructure to pipe that fuel to wherever you want it. And I think that is how you get the cost of the energy down, is by ensuring that every watt that's generated is actually converted into a fuel that can be stored and transported. And that is a very well documented and extremely important point of the cost of energy. The cost of energy is not the generation of it. And there's examples of this globally. The cost of energy is in how you ensure that you can utilize all the energy that's generated and get it to the consumer. So we looked at this globally, and there's plenty of examples of this around the world, that the cost of getting energy from the generation point to the consumer is by far more expensive than the generation. And that's what we need to be good at. The UK has some very, very talented chemists and chemical engineers and process engineers. And we need to utilize these people and get them to come up with even better solutions than we have today to deliver this technology. And that's how I think we'll get the energy costs down, is by improving that efficiency point that you're talking about at the point of converting it from energy into power to liquids.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Simon, I was taking your name in vain here. Having heard the answers from Doug and Ralph, are you reassured, is Loganair reassured that the jigsaw's coming together and that Loganair's well placed to use these new technologies and these producers and suppliers to decarbonise your fleet?
I think we are concerned that will there be enough SAF That's not just Loganair, it's the industry as a whole. There isn't enough now. I was reading IATA, that was mentioned already, IATA, the International Air Transport Association, and they're global. We're looking at the global supply of SAF. So it's doubled to 2 million tonnes in 2025, but that only represents 0.7% of the fuel needed globally. So I think it's all great, there are plans in place, but will it arrive at the pump for us to put into the aircraft? That's the concern we have, number one, and at what price? And that is an overriding concern of us at Loganair, but also the industry as a whole, I think. So I think it's great it's being discussed and all these things are happening, but will it flow through to the final product is our concern at the right price.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Bob. Michael, I think you're next with some questions.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I want to maybe just pick up on the issue of the type of SAF that you think is going to be able to meet that demand that the aviation sector has. Doug, from your earlier comments, I got the impression that you felt of the three generations of SAF, that the only one that's likely to meet the level of demand that the aviation industry will have is power to liquid. Is that the case? And I'm interested in Ralph's view in that as well, is that that's the only scalable option that would be able to meet the demands of the aviation industry in the next 10 to 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, the problem comes down to feedstock for the technologies. So there's only so much crops, there's only so much displacement of food that people can do with heifer. And when you start looking at the numbers and the footprints required to do that, it's not scalable. Because ultimately we need to get to a net zero by 2050. And you look at the amount of aviation fuel that's used globally, those numbers do not stack. So heifer is a stepping stone, as is the alcohol to jets and the second generation of fuel. I mean, everybody wants to use waste, and we don't want to not use waste. But is it a solution, a complete solution? No, it can be part of the solution, but it's not going to be the majority of the solution. And that's the key point here, is there are 3 or 4 horses in the race, and there's only one horse that's got enough legs to finish the race. And so, okay, we can get on the first 2 or 3 horses for the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, but we do need to jump horse at some point. And what was also very important is that people need to recognise that what I'm talking about is a proper solution to the net zero. And what we can't have is policies and industry have a short-termist view where they back the bio-based solutions, and at the end of the day there isn't enough feedstock there to deliver that, and that precludes the development of the power to liquid infrastructure and those technologies. It's about getting people's heads around the right sort of space, as it were, to make sure that, yeah, heifer's good, it's good for now, and there's other stepping stones, but ultimately by 2035 it should be a small percentage, and we should have got the power to liquids running, because I think it solves a lot of problems, the power to liquids. Not only does it solve the problem of the country's cost of energy, which is a point Bob was asking earlier. Why is energy so expensive in the UK? It's because we waste a lot of it. It's quite simply, we waste the energy, and there is no solution to transporting it or storing it. It's as simple as that. That's why it's so expensive. If you use this technology, not only will we bring down the cost of energy, but then we actually make economic growth for the country, because we've not got one arm behind our back on the cost of energy. And also, at the same time, we can become global leaders in selling the IP to other countries and then bring back money back into the country through those licenses. So this is the bigger picture that I think we should be thinking about. Maybe I sort of went off the comment there, but I wanted to get that point in there.
No,
There's a bigger picture there that power to liquids are that powerful in terms of solving not just the SAF problem, but the cost of energy problem, and also economic growth for the UK.
So just before I go to Ralph, from your expertise and knowledge, by, let's say, 2040, what percentage of SAF that would be being used by the aviation industry do you think will come from the power to liquid sector? Doug, do you want to go for
Oh,
that
sorry.
first? Yeah. Then
What
I'll
do
go to
I?
Ralph.
I think it very much depends on government policy. I would love to say, you know, an enormous percentage of it. But I think at the moment we're at this stage, it's a bit like where the internet was back in the late 80s, early 90s, where the internet was around and people didn't think it was of much use. And then sort of 5 or 6 years later, they realised the internet is absolutely brilliant and there's some really good search engines like Google, etc. I think we're at that stage with power to liquids where there's lots of different people doing it, but nobody's really got, oh, that's really the way forwards. And this is what I'm trying to say. And how much and how far we can scale is really determined by government policy. And, you know, quite simply, I've said that there's a skilled workforce here in Scotland, particularly in the oil and gas industry, and it's almost indistinguishable in terms of what skills you need to build these plants out. We have all of this capability in the UK to demonstrate the technology. It's more around how does government policy give the investors the confidence that when they back this, it's going to deliver. I think that, so that's why I can't answer the question, because I don't know what those policies are going to be and whether it's going to happen or not.
Okay, thanks. Ralph?
Yeah, I think Doug's analogy about a marathon is a useful way to think about this. We think all SAF is better than no SAF. A more sustainable option is better than none. The second generation or non-HEFA SAFs that come from kind of biological wastes or feedstocks are more like a mid-distance runner. So they're really important in the next 10, 15 years to get us on the track to decarbonise. But longer term, power to liquid is the only one that can scale. And it's almost difficult to comprehend how much the volume of fuel that's going to be needed is. IATA estimate by 2050 we'd need a 360-fold increase in SAF demand globally. So if you imagine our current supply chain of SAF, it's got to increase by 300 times plus to meet that. And once you start to bring biomasses or wastes into that, the pure logistical challenge of trying to transport that much material around to make a fuel out of becomes challenging. When we look at policy that has already set that out, if we look at our neighbours in Europe, in the EU, they have a sub-mandate for eSAF, which is power to liquid, as we call it in the UK, and there is a sub-mandate in the UK as well. The European one is much more aggressive than the UK one currently. And we think ultimately the opportunity cost of converting those biomasses or wastes into a fuel for combustion may not be the best use for those. And that's why I mentioned at the start of this meeting that the use of biomasses in SAF needs to be incorporated into a wider biomass strategy for Scotland. And there needs to be a decision about where that value sits compared to other things like making other sustainable chemicals from that, which may have a longer lifetime than being used as a combustion fuel. But ultimately, the direct use of electrons to synthesize a fuel is ultimately going to be more energy efficient than growing a biomass and then converting that into a fuel, just purely because there's less steps in that conversion chain. So I would agree with Doug. I think we see a really clear place for bio-based SAFs that are non-HEFA, so non-food competitive sources of feedstock in the next 2 decades. But ultimately, when we're starting to get to the volumes of 50, 60, 70% SAF in the second half of this century, power to liquid is the only solution that we can see scaling to the volumes of fuel that are needed to provide that decarbonisation.
Okay. So in terms of production then of SAF, do you think that, and you touched on this, Ralph, earlier on, do you think that SAF production is more likely to be a larger number of smaller sites producing it, or a fewer number of large sites producing SAF? What's your, and I'm thinking here about what Doug was saying as well, about trying to get close to where landfall is for electricity, which would lead to me to think that it's actually going to be a larger number of smaller sites rather than a small number of large sites?
I think there's two different models that will develop. I think Doug is correct. When we have large offshore wind, as an example, and we have tens of megawatts of electricity landing in a single location, we're likely to see some centralized production around that. So that's where you kind of have your major nodes or your motorways of fuel coming from. But because we've developed over the last 20, 30 years in the UK a distributed energy generation system, because we have wind farms across very large geographical areas, those smaller sites will become really important. As an example, if you take the number of onshore wind farms in the UK, there's about 9,000 of those. And when you look at those from a quantitative value in terms of their output, half of them are under 2 megawatts in output, and that's tiny for something like a large fuel plant, say at Grangemouth. And what we're seeing in electricity pricing, to speak to Bob's point, is that distributed nature of generation makes it difficult to capture that electricity effectively, and because people tend to not live where it's very windy or where it's very sunny at a global level. So all of that energy is being generated far away from consumer points, so that I think there'll be a blended approach. We will have large centralized plants in key strategic locations. Hydroelectric is another great example for Scotland, where you have those higher concentrated power generation opportunities. There will be larger production facilities, and I think off that we'll see a hub and spoke develop, or we call it the milk run internally, where you have smaller sites that are making primary fuel that might need upgrading or blending, and you're taking that from a distributed network into a centralized point that may have a larger production capacity. And actually, Grangemouth would be a great example of that, and we've looked at it in other locations like Flodda and Immingham across the UK, where you can have large centralized technology making very large volumes of fuel, and that being supplemented by smaller plants in the surrounding geography and transporting that fuel into the central location to share the infrastructure for transport.
Okay, thanks. Doug, do you have a view on the type of this model of how you think production will develop in the future?
I think what Ralph's saying is absolutely right. I think in the short term it will be a lot of smaller modular plants, because I actually think that the investors want to get confidence in the technology as well. So I think the modularisation is a very good approach. We actually have designed a containerised version of our power to liquids plant, and I think it's quite helpful that you can then tailor that modular design to whatever the renewable energy level is at that site. So if you've got a 4 megawatt site, a 2 megawatt site, you just multiply up the number of containers and generate the appropriate amount of power to liquid fuel. And I think that that's what investors will want to see in the short term, that these units are up and running. That'll give confidence in the complete technology. But then when you've really got to deal with the larger scale volumes, that won't do it. You know, you're gonna use any energy source, and wherever that energy source is, you're going to co-locate the hydrogen production, and you're going to get the CO2 in, and then you're going to make it at that site. So that, as been mentioned before, the hydrogen doesn't get transported anywhere because it's extremely costly. It needs to be made on site and converted into a liquid.
Okay. I'm looking here at the detail that we've been provided, and that is of the SAF production across the UK. And from what I can see from the papers that was provided by the Royal Aeronautical Society, there are around 19 sites across the UK where SAF production is taking place or development, and has been given support by the UK Government's Advanced Fuels Fund. Given what you've said in terms of what you think the model of production is likely to look like, particularly in the earlier stages, which is modular, probably smaller scale, and also given the natural attributes that Scotland has, from this data, it would appear that there is only one site in Scotland that has secured funding from the UK Government's Advanced Fuel Fund, and that's the one that you mentioned earlier on in Orkney. Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's a very good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that, why those decisions are made like that. I mean, we've been going over 6 years now as a company developing these e-fuels. And when we looked, we actually thought that EMEC up in the Orkneys was way ahead of anywhere else in terms of understanding the renewable energies scenario. They had tidal power, they had wind power, they had hydrogen on site, and we actually developed our first Guinness World Record breaking 100% synthetic fuel was made on Orkney. And we found, and when we've gone to look at our scale-up plans, we actually use a company in Aberdeen. I think that they have all the skill sets we wanted. They were the right size. They were quite dynamic. They weren't a massive EPC company, and they weren't too small for us. So they had the skill set that we needed. So I can't honestly answer your question as to why there's not more advanced fuel funding gone to Scotland. I don't know. Is the answer.
Okay, that's
You've
helpful. Ralph, I don't know, do you have a view on why that's the case?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that, and I think it comes back to what we were talking about
I
before.
was actually
earlier.
asking Ralph first of all, but...
Oh, sorry.
So on you go, Simon. No, on you go.
No, I thought you were pointing at me. I apologise.
Be that sharp as a politician.
I thought you were pointing at me, but I suspect you were looking at the screen. So,
I
Ralph,
am, yeah.
Ralph, carry on.
I'm happy, Simon. Ralph, I'll come to you next. Simon, if you want to pass comment.
Now, I was going to come back to my previous point, which was, and I think some of it is driven by the southeast centricity and where the debate is and where the big noise is around SAF for aviation. There is some very big airlines in the UK who need that SAF. So there is a big debate down there. I think where Scotland benefits is an abundance of energy, of renewable energy, and a potential to produce it. So I think there is a debate to be had about what more could be done in Scotland. But I think just the noise is further south, and that's not a good thing necessarily, I would say.
Okay. Ralph?
Yeah, we were quite disappointed with some of the outcomes from AFF. We don't understand why the more renewably rich parts of the UK were overlooked.
Because I can't see anything in Northern Ireland.
No, there was no AFF fund successful in Northern Ireland, much to our chagrin. But we think that is coming from a conventional attitude looking at centralised production. And that model is not going to work in the future. We talk about looking back in 20 years of what the energy system looks like. And centralised production of fuel is really important, but it's going to change. And we think a lot of the mindset was focused on existing facilities and how they could transition to a more sustainable model, rather than looking at what a sustainable model in the future might look like. But we don't know ultimately, but we were very disappointed that there were not more projects in Northern Ireland than Scotland.
Well, that's helpful because that brings me on to the next question I wanted to ask, and that is, do you then think that the UK Government's Advanced Fuel Fund and the way in which it's been allocated properly reflects the way in which the SAF sector is likely to develop over the course of the next 10 to 20 years? Ralph?
I think it definitely overlooks a key consideration. And when you look globally at SAF projects, they are located where there is abundant renewable energy at a relatively low price. And that is the key driver from a business model perspective. It's the largest input cost to those facilities. So for us, there's almost a consideration that needs to be made on that's being missed in those applications. And part of that is, as Doug mentioned earlier, the transmission of electricity costs the consumer. So we are actually paying to not receive renewable electricity at a network level. And that is the key unlocking aspect that we need to figure out a solution to, we feel, to unlock a SAF industry. And that will, I think, benefit Scotland as a region the most, because it's where the most of that electricity is generated that can't be used effectively currently.
Okay. I don't know, Doug, whether you want to say anything on that?
I agree with what Ralph say. I mean, I think that Scotland, you know, with the Moray East, Moray West wind farms, I use those as an example because they generate so much power. And actually those are the sort of numbers we really need to be looking at in terms of making SAF and getting this wasted or unused energy turned into something of value. That's why I think, you know, Scotland's very well positioned. I think it's something like 4.6 terawatts in the first half of the year was wasted in the UK. 4 of that was in Scotland. So that shows you what the proportion is of the benefit, and that's why I keep saying Scotland's very well positioned to make the most out of this.
Okay. Thanks, Kavita.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to come in on that? Or you do? Sorry, I'll bring you and then I'll go to Douglas and then I'll come back to you for your other questions afterwards.
That's great. I'd just like to follow up the questions that Michael's been asking there, because if you think about Grangemouth, you've got the refinery which just shut this year, you've got proposals for green hydrogen production. Just to nail the issue about curtailment payments, it was 125 million in Scotland for the first 6 months of the year, so it's 250 million a year, but UK-wide it's £1 billion a year. So there's something about how we repurpose that money and actually get it invested. And in the renewable sector, they always talk about confidence and uncertainty to invest. So do we have an opportunity at Grangemouth? Also, given it is quite close to Glasgow and Edinburgh airports. So you would actually have the production, you'd have the power, you've got the tech, you've got the people, and you're actually close to where you want to take that power. That if we don't do it, we're going to miss out. I don't just mean Scotland, but globally. We've now got this potential SAF bill. What do we need next to actually get that trigger, to actually get the delivery that would bring all the benefits you've all been talking about quite effectively? Do you want to kick off, Doug?
For me, I think it's about getting everybody around the table. And I mean by that investors, producers, government, people who can make those decisions. Because I feel like I'm preaching all the time, and it's like I said, it's a bit like in the early days of the internet when people didn't really believe it was of any, and it's trying to get people to recognise that when you zoom out, SAF is the kickstarter of power to liquids, because nobody's going to argue that long haul flights are going to be with electric vehicles or hydrogen. It's not going to happen. I think Airbus this year have kicked their hydrogen ideas down the road by 5 to 10 years. So they know what the score is there. So for me, it's about getting all those parties around a table and making the argument, or not as the case may be, but properly thrashing that out. And people putting, I've started drawing up models where different energy sources come online over the next 25 years. And then where would they be positioned in the UK? And the power to liquid market, where can you use existing infrastructure? This is something that should be done by the Department for Transport, or pulling people in together, pulling Scotland, you guys. I'm not, to be honest, it's only the last 6 months I've been pulled into meetings like this. So I am preaching, this is the first time I've come to these sort of things. So, but for me, it's very much about, we've got to get the investors, the big investment, and particularly the National Wealth Fund. I really don't understand why we meet all of their criteria, but they are very risk averse. Yet they have the biggest mandate, which is with that 28 billion, they're supposed to kickstart the UK economy with it. And from what I've seen of what that's been put to, it's very risk averse and won't kickstart any economy from what I've seen. I think people need to work out a proper solution to kickstarting the economy, and that, for me, starts with energy and getting the cost of energy down, and the power to liquids is the way to go about doing that. I think that, the National Wealth Fund, investors, everybody around the table.
So is it getting a proposal on the table that is the key thing to actually get Sorry, you're just going to come straight in, Simon. Yeah.
No, I was going to comment on that because part of in the bill, the revenue certainty mechanism is the one tool that everyone's hoping is going to work. And we were cynical at first when it came out because they better be sure it does work. In other words, does it drive investment? Does it lower the cost of capital and allow people to invest in these plants to produce the SAF that's needed? So yeah, at first we were not sure about that because it's going to add cost and complexity potentially. There's a levy in there. There's the whole to and from. Could it end up as a system where the industry through the levy is perpetually funding producers? So I think there's a real question mark as to whether that policy alone is the right policy that brings the SAF investment needed. So I think that's a question of scrutiny, I think, on this bill specifically, is will it work and is there enough evidence to show that it will work, not just in the design, but the final mechanics of it, particularly the levy and the strike price that have to be agreed.
Doug, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I just want to make the point there that I think what Simon's saying is absolutely right, but do I believe it's really going to kickstart the real solution to this? And I think that there needs to be a differentiation within the mechanism, where everybody around the table recognises that there are stepping stones like HEFA and alcohol to jet, etc. And what are they allowed to do, and how does the revenue certainty mechanism work for them? But also the real horse to back is the power to liquids, because that's the one that's going to create the economic growth. The HEFA, more than likely, we're going to have to import all the feedstocks for that. So we're just going to be paying as taxpayers for something that should actually we be making here in the UK. Another point that I haven't made today, which I just would also use for the power to liquids, is that it gives us a sovereign capability, which is also extremely important for the UK, where we actually generate energy and put it into a use that can be used by our military and domestically.
Yeah, I think your points about National Wealth Fund are critical because there's investment, but there's also saving money from curtailment costs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a joined-up thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to come in this, Ralph, at all?
Yeah, I think that the points that Simon made about reducing the cost of capital is a really key thing, and that's ultimately what the revenue certainty mechanism is designed to do. But there are other ways to make those investments more attractive, and particularly to rebalance the distribution of SAF across the UK. And the EU has taken quite an interesting approach to this. So they have a parallel to their SAF strategy, they have an anti-tankering policy. And what that means is that airlines can't essentially overfuel their flights in key hub airports. They have to uplift fuel at the right time, at the right amount, so they're not basically flying additional fuel around to avoid having to refuel in less well-connected airports. And what that, with their SAF strategy, has resulted in is that in 2035, there will have to physically be SAF supplied into all EEA airports. And that has changed the conversation around SAF in the EU. Because if you are a regional airport that is not near a large fuel producer, you will have to find a way to get SAF to your airlines to allow them to uplift effectively. A suggestion would be that there are other levers like that that could be used to make areas such as Scotland more attractive and move that bias further north away from the southeast, where there is a huge demand that's currently pulling a lot of activity into it. The other point, and I think you raised very well, Sarah, is that Grangemouth is almost an ideal test case for the SAF industry in the UK. We've looked at it for a long time. Personally, as a chemical engineer, Grangemouth is a huge heritage location for process chemistry and chemical engineering, and there is an opportunity there to show how it can be a model for a just transition that works for people who work in the oil and gas sector, which historically hasn't been particularly successful because they're reusing exactly the same molecules. And I think that's one of the key aspects that's important for me, is that sustainable aviation fuel from a chemical point of view is no different at a high level than the traditional fossil fuels we use. And that means that those skill sets, the capabilities, the manufacturing and maintenance understanding is already there, and is currently crying out for more primary molecules to come into the industry to secure and future-proof those jobs. And SAF is one of the solutions to that, and has a ability to scale beyond the current capabilities that are in the region. So it not only offers a way to reinforce and secure existing jobs, but also grow those industries that have seen a significant decline in the last few decades in Scotland.
I think that's very helpful, the comments that you've all made there. And the choice is doing it ourselves or importing it from somewhere else. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Back to you, convener.
Douglas, over to you.
Simon, a question for you, first of all. Going back to the economics of SAF, should we, as passengers, just expect to pay increased costs for air travel in the future as we use more and more SAF?
So I think that's a very key question. So at the moment, I was saying that we're currently paying under our mandate, the SAF cost is around 3 times as much as conventional jet A1. So those costs have to be absorbed somewhere. You know, we're making around £4.50 profit per passenger at the moment. So you can imagine where that can very easily be eaten up if your fuel price is trebling or even going to 5 times the amount, which is the prediction potentially for third generation. So I think the answer is there will be more cost unless the price of the SAF can come down through volume increases. And all that will happen is it will drive prices up ultimately. I think number one. Number two, particularly for regional airlines, I think there's a really important difference here, is there are other pathways to SAF. And one of those is new technology. And if you look at the various roadmaps that are out there, new technology aircraft can deliver, so in the UK roadmap, new technology aircraft can deliver up to 16% of the decarbonisation needed. In some of the roadmaps out there, new technology can deliver as much as 30%. For an airline like Loganair, in the very long term, our entire fleet could potentially be alternative technology, not using SAF, but using hydrogen or pure electric or battery. And I think that's a topic that does not get the airtime it deserves. We spend a lot of time rightly talking about SAF, and it's a very important solution, particularly for long haul, as Doug said. But for regional operators, and particularly here in Scotland, the potential for technology in the 2030s is very ripe. And we should, I think, be talking about that much more, particularly at a political level as well.
So the future for your own airline, you wouldn't see it so much as SAF, but more other technologies instead, because you're doing shorter journeys.
Exactly, because of the nature of what we're doing shorter journeys up to 300 or 400 kilometres, smaller aircraft. That's where the technology will move first. Mm-hmm. You're not going to see, I think Doug said it, you're not going to see, you know, a hydrogen-powered or battery-powered long-haul aircraft. You're just not in all of our lifetimes. But you will see a hydrogen or an electric or a hybrid electric, and we're working with multiple producers. Of those I actually worked on before I joined Loganair. You will see that technology move. I'm very convinced of it in the 2030s. Mm-hmm.
But if you were...
Just that I know Kevin is very keen to ask on future technologies. Okay. So at some stage, without going on to the areas he was indicated he might have an interest, would it be appropriate to bring him in now, or...
Go for it.
It's fine, I'll wait. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So back to the economics, if you were just moving to SAF, what would it mean for the prices?
Well, it's a difficult thing to pitch out, because it depends where new technology goes. It depends where the price of SAF goes. All we can say for certain now is that the price of SAF is going to be anywhere between 3 and 5 times what it is for conventional fuel. And so if you think about that, for a typical airline for us, fuel represents around 20 to 30% of our direct operating costs. So you can, as they say, work out what the impact's going to be. I'm not going to give a precise figure, but it will follow through to higher airfares.
Okay. And Doug, you mentioned, the key for all this is actually getting the cost of energy down. And I'm just trying to think how we actually go about that. Because if we look at the CFD prices for offshore wind, you're right, we've got an abundance of energy, but it's not really cheap.
No, agree.
And it's how we, and especially with the CFD prices, that's us pegged in for the next 10, 15 years. So how do we actually reduce the prices to actually make things like hydrogen production, to make SAF production actually economical?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's why we need a proper think tank on how you get the energy costs down. Really, power to liquids is just the storage and transportation solution to whatever that energy generation is. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the solution is to get an I mean, wind, like you say, offshore wind energy is quite expensive compared to other parts in the world globally. And one of the challenges we'll have is competing globally at a cost-effective price in the UK if we decide to do it here in the UK. Mm-hmm. So that will be, at the moment, there are places out in the UAE where there's big hydrogen hubs going in, lots of solar going into the deserts there, etc. Those will be even bigger hubs for power to liquids.
So how would we ever compete with that when we've got CFD prices that are, very expensive compared to competing against a solar farm in the Middle East?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I don't know what the solution is to that, to get in there. I think there is a way to get our energy costs down from where it is at the moment. I mean, I think we're fourth most expensive in Europe at the moment, and I think that we could probably get that down to, so that we're sort of like somewhere halfway down the pecking order by putting power to liquids there as a way to solve that. Whether Europe could ever compete with a UAE solar farm, I don't know. And how we would do that, we would have,
And I guess you mentioned curtailment energy previously, that could be used. But I guess that's only, that's not constant. Over the last 2 weeks, it was a nice, very windy day today. I'm sure there's plenty of curtailed energy, but the last 2 weeks there's been basically no wind. Yeah. So how could industry survive when it doesn't have that almost steady guaranteed load. Steady?
Yeah, understood. So we have modelling. We've modelled this. We actually put like wind farm type power generation through our electrolyzers and work out how we would model that in a sort of theoretical way, and it all just around buffering, and you'd actually use some of the power to liquids during those periods to actually power your system, but you'd have a turn down on the plant itself, and then when the wind comes back up, you kick it up again.
So it's really just storing more of the fuel at the end when you have that.
Yeah, you just have a buffer tank basically. Yeah, and whether you do that with hydrogen or whether you do that with your power to liquids, that's a debate depending on the efficiency.
And would have zonal pricing meant it was much more attractive for Scotland? Because there could have been cheaper electricity closer to where the source was.
Sorry, say that again.
Zonal pricing, would have that made a difference for SAF production in Scotland?
Sorry, the what pricing?
Zonal pricing.
So,
Zonal?
Zono?
Zonal.
Basically, there was a proposal to reduce the price for electricity in areas where it was produced, i.e. it was zonal, the price was reduced.
Zonal. Yes. Sorry. Oh, apologies.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's a hearing issue.
I had to get my ear in there.
It's maybe my
Stan Douglas as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm slightly deaf in that ear. Sorry. So the zonal prices,
Would have that made a difference for SAF production in Scotland?
I'm not familiar with the zonal cost. Sorry, apologies. I don't know.
Okay. Ralph, did you have a view on zonal pricing, whether it would have helped Scotland in SAF production?
I think cheaper electricity will help any renewable energy related project in Scotland. The specifics of that mechanism will, it's always the devil's in the detail with those things. To get back to your original point, Douglas, around the cost and will that be passed to the consumer? We're not sure, but one of the things that we're doing with early projects is deliberately targeting lower volume production so that the capital and the onset cost to the end consumer, to the airline, is lower while we develop and refine these to the market. So instead of going for as much SAF as possible straight away and locking in 15-year offtake agreements at very high prices, like you talked about in the CFD model, we're trying to attract smaller scale projects which are at a scale that's relevant for decarbonisation, but does not lock somebody like Simon into a 15-year very high price of fuel. And we see that as very early, a way to develop capability and supply and work through some of the efficiency savings to mean that onset cost becomes as low as possible. And the other thing that does is crowd in potential investors, because you're not talking about a £500 million SAF plant, you're talking an order of magnitude less in investment, and that means that there are new people who can become involved in that conversation. So you could have airlines, fuel producers, fuel suppliers, not just your very large primary oil and gas movers investing in these projects. And we think that's an important part of the solution to this, because there is a incumbent thinking that it is only the current large fuel producers that can solve this issue. And that means that we're beholden to how they think that it's best to solve those. And some of their thinking we agree with, and there's others we might disagree with, being a net zero company. So there's not an easy answer, I think, to pass on to consumers. I think when you look at people like IATA, they say, yes, flying will cost more. But that's going to happen anyway, because the aviation sector will have to pay ETS fines for use of fossil fuels. So it's impossible to figure out whether the ETS cost will be more or whether use of SAF will be more. I think ultimately people much more intelligent than myself in the fuel space will figure out what's the best way to keep the prices down.
And Ralph, you mentioned Acorn earlier. Where would that fit into the SAF jigsaw, so to speak?
We think that early pilot or lighthouse projects like Acorn are really important because they get you familiar with the logistics and the unseen issues there are with developing new energy systems. So if we take incumbent electricity and oil and gas, we have over a century of familiarity with the skills, the people, the systems that work well. And projects like Acorn are really key and crucial in understanding how you move carbon, store it successfully, and the skills you need and the technology you need to be able to action that and create value from it. We're skeptical about carbon capture and storage as a long-term solution for some industries. We think it will be really important for others, like cement manufacture as an example. But the ability to capture and use and transport very large volumes of carbon is one of the two underpinning things of making a SAF industry. The other one being access to cheap and readily available renewable electricity. Mm-hmm. So if you have both of those things in abundance, you have the building blocks to make an industry that can be built on sustainable molecules like SAF.
But I guess you would capture it then at Acorn, then it would be, SAF would be produced, but then it would, the carbon would still be released when that was burned basically by the aircraft, wouldn't it? Yes,
so there's a separate designation of fuels like that called recycled carbon fuels, and they have a recognition that you're essentially using that carbon molecule twice rather than once. So there is some sustainability benefit, but it's marginal. And there's more efficient use, but not the most efficient use, and that's where PTL comes an important part of the puzzle. But projects like Acorn create the industry, the skill set, and the people that can use the knowledge of capturing and moving CO2 in large scales and volumes, that then starts to create the underlying knowledge base that you need to create a SAF industry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Convener.
And I'm going to bring Kevin in now because I think you strayed, Simon, onto an area that he would like to ask you questions on. No problems. Kevin's off.
Thank you very much, Convener. And we have touched upon some of the other alternatives to SAF, such as battery and hydrogen. I wonder, Simon, if you could give us an indication of how far advanced Loganair is at looking at some of those alternative technologies, particularly given the fact that you operate lifeline short-haul services. And while we recognise that battery storage and hydrogen is not necessarily going to be able to be utilised in long-haul flights, it very much is for the likes of Loganair. So can you give us an indication of where you're at?
Yes, this is a really exciting area, I think, and I would say Loganair is very forward-looking. And I'm going to say that from a perspective of coming into Loganair 6 weeks ago, but having previously worked in this space, but also having worked in regional aviation for many, many years. When I look around at the regional airlines across Europe, in particular, that are looking at new technology, Loganair is a perfect example of one where it could be deployed because of the network. You mentioned it, the short lifeline routes. And secondly, because of the aircraft it's operating and the business model it has. So it has got ahead of the game. We have two quite public engagements with two companies, one with a company that's building or developing a 30-seat hybrid electric aircraft called Heart Aerospace, and another one with a hydrogen engine developer called Zero Avia. Obviously, you're also familiar with our existing aircraft, probably ATR. They're developing a future generation of that aircraft that could be either hydrogen fuel cell or hybrid as well. So we're actively looking at those technologies. We're working with those companies in particular to see the suitability of the aircraft on our network, what would be needed by way of infrastructure, because that's a really key enabler here, is it the hydrogen infrastructure or the electricity infrastructure, particularly out in the islands, and how that can be achieved. And then there's the near-term opportunity. So if you look at the sort of technology pathways, there's three. There's pure electric, hybrid electric, and hydrogen. And they're all in sequence in terms of time. Hydrogen is probably the last to come. Hybrid electric is the middle. I'd say there's opportunities with pure electric, but that tends to be smaller vehicles, shorter distances. And we're interested in all of them. So you hear our CEO saying we're technology agnostic. We want one of them or all of them to succeed because we see a lot of potential for our airline there.
That's very interesting. I mean, one of the things which is extremely concerning is that all of the eggs in one basket scenario. Yeah. Or picking the wrong technology, a bit like VHS and Betamax in the video world. So in terms of that look-see at all that's available, that probably comes at a greater cost in terms of the work that you're doing, looking at everything. Do you think that governments are supporting the likes of yourselves as well as they could be in terms of the hunt for those technologies?
I think the simple answer is probably not enough. There is a lot of debate, and I said it in the previous intervention with Douglas there's a lot of absolutely justifiable discussion around SAF because it's absolutely essential. But as I quoted some numbers there about what new technology can deliver, it can deliver in the long run as much as 30% of the decarbonisation that's needed to hit those net zero targets. But it doesn't necessarily get the airtime it deserves. And I would say that's in Scotland, in the UK, and globally, in fact, because of the focus on SAF. So I think we need to talk about new technology more. I think that governments need to talk about new technology more. I think the Scottish government and you as a prime, like we spoke about SAF, there's massive opportunity in Scotland for this tech to move. So I think it should be discussed more. Incentives for the investment needed to bring these aircraft to market. This is for a typical aircraft developer. It's a 10-year cycle to bring these type of aircraft to market. The rough order of magnitude about $1 billion to bring a new aircraft type to market. So talking about how that can be incentivized, and then incentives to bring the aircraft into operation as well, with very mundane things like route charges, airport fees, infrastructure at the remote points to refuel as well.
Okay, let's look at the infrastructure, not just in terms of the electricity or hydrogen, but also SAF as well. And you've talked around about that we have to look at all of this in some depth. And there's been various discussions during the course of the morning around about where folk believe that governments have not been looking as they should at opportunity. Do you think there should be, at this stage, and this is a question for all of you guys basically, an audit of where we are at, what infrastructure there currently is that could be reutilised, as Doug was saying earlier, right across these islands to make sure that we grasp the ultimate opportunities, whether that be for Loganair in terms of electric aircraft, hydrogen-powered aircraft, or for SAF as a whole, right across these islands. So maybe Simon first, and then we'll come to Doug.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure piece is really important for new tech. It's a bit like cars. You know, unless the charging infrastructure's there, people are not going to buy the EV cars to use them because they have anxiety on where do they charge. So you have to have, it's like a chicken and egg. Unless the infrastructure's there, we won't buy the aeroplanes to operate them there. So there does have to be, I think, Kevin, you described it as an audit, but a sort of a look at how is that industry, particularly the airport industry, developing, and in Scotland specifically out in the islands, how is it looking long-term at investing in the infrastructure that's going to be needed when these aircraft come online? And Doug mentioned the Airbus timeline. We're looking at the 2030s for this technology to come in. So there's time to develop the infrastructure, but there's not a ton of time. So it's a debate that needs to be done now, and we can't drive the infrastructure. We will procure the aircraft and operate the aircraft, but the infrastructure is generally a bit like fuel. It's provided by the airport or the handler. So I think it is timely to get everybody together, and in particular to look at where the infrastructure development is out in the islands.
Okay. Doug, please.
I'd agree with that. As in, like, I think an audit would be very, very useful, because there's nothing worse than getting 3 or 4 years down a project and then somebody coming along and going, well, why didn't you go and do it over there? I mean, it'd be awful. So I think an audit is always a good idea, especially with a new lens and a set of criteria by which to evaluate the new technologies with a complete cost understanding. What I mean by that is it includes the infrastructure cost and the practicalities of doing whatever it is we decide to do with that particular technology. Because I think that then everybody around the table, including the investors, the National Wealth Fund, etc., everybody understands why we've gone in a particular direction.
By the sounds of it, you've done some of your own auditing around about existing infrastructure. So if you've been doing that anyway, there's no reason why government, UK government, shouldn't be doing that right across the board.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, Callum Miller, MP for Bicester and Woodstock, he came to visit a couple of weeks ago, and he suggested exactly the same thing that you did. I didn't prompt it. He said, well, what about an audit? Because it doesn't sound right. And I totally agree with that.
Sounds the logical way forward to me. Ralph, please.
It's more than worthwhile. The thing that frustrates us, because we're innovating not just in the aviation space, but across transport, our company has operated for 15 years, primarily starting in the automotive sector, and we've seen the shift to electrification there. The people who need to be in those audits don't actually know they need to be there. Okay, we're talking about completely overhauling an energy system. We've talked about cheap renewables, and that means that not just renewables developers need to be there, but the other users of those renewable assets need to be included in those conversations. So there's a real issue around siloing of decarbonisation strategies. As a whole, I don't think that's a UK or a Scotland specific issue, and it's about finding the right people who can contribute useful information around that, because there's no point decarbonising all of our aviation sector at the cost of heavy industry and road transport, because that's not going to work.
Thank you, and a good point. Final question. Obviously, there's been considerable improvements in fuel efficiency of aircraft over the past while. Simon, this is probably mainly for you. Do you think that there's the potential for even more improvement in all of that as we move forward?
So I think if you look at, so you split that into existing aircraft technology, in other words, gas turbine powered aircraft, and new technology. I think in existing gas turbine powered aircraft, you're reaching the bottom of the sort of bathtub curve in terms of what you can do to get more fuel efficiency. That's not to say there is, but there's not a step change.
Sure.
The big difference with new tech is there is potentially a step change, because you're changing the propulsion system, and you're moving away from, in almost every case, from a gas turbine engine to an electric engine. And if you run an airline, one of the most complicated things are the engines. Very expensive, lots of moving parts, very difficult to maintain and very expensive to maintain. If you move to an electric model, it's a much simpler propulsion device, and all of the modelling shows that will bring efficiencies in maintenance and cost as well. And a lot of those new technology providers are talking about, 15, 20, 30% reductions in operating cost because of the switch to technology. So I think, to answer your question, there is a step change potential for new technology in the operating cost of aircraft and the efficiency.
Doug, did you want to come in there?
I would just, I'd agree. I have some background. I'm an aerospace engineer. I have some understanding of what Simon's saying there, in that the cost of running the engines, the electrification could massively simplify that and make it significantly cheaper. Although it's not aircraft, there are places in Europe where these short-haul, in this case not flights, but ferries, correct, because it's such a short run over the water, they just charge while they're offloading and loading, and it goes continuously, and then they charge overnight. I mean, those sort of scenarios, there's definitely a market there for those technologies.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
I'm just going to bring the Deputy Convener in a moment, but I would just say the trouble is when it's an interesting subject and everyone's got lots of questions, you overrun the time, and that's fine. I don't mind that. I've delayed the Cabinet Secretary from no, she can wait because this is interesting and informative. But I would try and encourage you, if I may, to give short answers. And if you agree with each other, you can just, of course, say that so-and-so is right, rather than each answering the question in a slightly different way. Sorry, that's a gentle push for timekeeping. Deputy Convener, you've got some questions.
Yeah, it's a quick question around Project Willow, which you'll be aware of, for Grangemouth, has two potential SAF projects, one which is Project 6 and one which is Project 8. Project 6 being a HEFA project and the other one being an e-methanol and methanol to jet project. Project 6, the HEFA project, suggested could be operational by 2032. And Project 8, it suggested it could be operational by 2035. Do you think the timelines that have been suggested for both of these projects and Project Willow are reasonable, or do you think they're optimistic? Ralph? Oh, can't hear you, Ralph, I'm afraid.
Sorry, we're coming through now.
That's you, yeah.
What we're seeing across large SAF projects is that infrastructure, skills and groundworks are causing large cost and time increases. We've had projects in the US quote a 200% increase in costs and a 60% increase in delivery schedule. We're seeing a lot of those larger projects post-2030. Our smaller ones we're targeting for pre-2030, and we think it's important that we find ways to make SAF before the mandate wrap-up that we're going to see in 2030.
Okay. Doug?
I'd agree with Ralph. I think it's there is a reasonable amount of optimism around those timelines.
Okay. We had some suggestion in our previous evidence session that they thought 2035 was optimistic. But you think it's probably broadly in line?
Yeah, I mean, it just, at the end of the day, there's three things you play with, isn't there? There's this sort of time, quality, and I said there's three things, I've forgotten the third one.
I often do.
I'll come back to you after the meeting.
But, yeah, I mean, I think it depends on at the end of the day, it will depend on the investment. The time, yeah, time, cost and quality. So if you throw more money at it, you can bring the timeline down, typically.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Sarah, I think you've got a brief question before we come to Mark Ruskell.
Well, I suppose really it's how we actually get on with this and actually get the investment that we're actually going to need. Because if we don't invest in SAF, presumably we're just going to import it from other countries. So just wondering what your thoughts are about that in terms of costs for companies and for passengers if we don't actually start producing it ourselves?
I don't know what the mechanisms are and what we should do next, but I do know that we've tried very hard to lobby the National Wealth Fund. We've been lucky enough to be funded by the MOD to actually develop our sustainable aviation fuel, and we've actually developed a 100% drop-in, so you can actually develop a fuel which the military could just mix at any blend they want and run it in their aircraft. So the technology exists. But they have also tried to lobby and help us with the National Wealth Fund in terms of getting funding, because we actually need, you know, we're talking about economic growth here, and, you know, the AFF fund, I think, was just under 200 million, and it was spread across an enormous number of horses in the race. And actually, we need plants that are going to cost, in the short term, 100 million to build out. And so it needs some proper players around the table to make those sort of decisions, and to get confidence that from a technical point of view, it's de-risked properly. I can't answer your question, Sarah, in terms of what we do next. You're probably better placed than I am, but I know that we need to get all the sort of the other players in the UK around the table, so Oxy CCU, Catagen, anybody who's doing power to liquids, and have a discussion around what the government thinks, the Department for Transport thinks about the solution in terms of it being an enabler to economic growth. That's the key thing for me, because SAF just happens to be the kickstarter for that, if you see what I mean. But the bigger picture is getting the cost of energy down and actually creating economic growth. And I think if that was the focus, then I think everything else would flow from that, because that's actually what the National Wealth Fund's about. It's actually stimulating this economic growth.
Thanks. I can see Ralph's nodding his head, as is Simon. So Ralph, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I agree with Doug. I think short term, what SAF projects are trying to do is bring the capital cost down, so that capital hump is easier to get over. I think the principle of the revenue certainty mechanism is trying to address this. But as I said earlier, the devil will be in the detail of how that works, because what we're hearing from airlines who are ultimately the consumers of this is that creates a layer of transparency issue where they're concerned they're not getting best value for fuel. So it really does come down to how those mechanisms are going to function.
Yeah, thanks. And Simon, did you want to come in?
Actually, with the point he just made.
Can I congratulate you, Simon, on following the prompt? If you not, we'll take it as an agreement, Sarah. So thank you. Now we're going to move to Mark, who's been waiting patiently and may have had some of his questions asked before, I fear.
Well, I mean, I think in part, convener. So I wanted to come back on the UK emissions trading scheme, and I think, Ralph, you kind of alluded to that earlier on. I wonder if I could come back to you on your comments on that, just to explain it, because I think what I'm struggling to understand is how the ETS will work alongside the measures that are in this bill in order to, you know, help and assist the rollout of SAF. So if you could offer us some views on that, that would be good. In particularly in relation to the, you know, the change in the ETS at the moment and the withdrawal of the free allocation for aviation would be quite useful. And then after that, I'll probably ask Simon to come in as well. Ralph.
Yeah, so just as a very brief overview, the UK emissions trading system is essentially a cost of polluting that's put on certain industries. There are some that are obligated to be part of that. Steel is a good example, cement production, but also aviation is being included, is currently being onboarded in both the UK and the EU ETS. There's a recognition by the scheme operator that some emissions at the moment are inevitable because the technology is not there or the fuels aren't there as an alternative, and they are then allocated what's called a free allowance. And that free allowance is basically a pass on what is considered state-of-the-art unavoidable emissions for that industry. That is a declining mechanism over time, and the aviation sector is uniquely positioned in that it does not have readily available alternatives that other industries do. So, for instance, direct electrification, as Simon's mentioned, isn't available for long-haul flights, which also happen to be the ones that are the most carbon intensive because they burn the most fuel. So there's a concern that the aviation sector is being unfairly penalised by the ETS purely because it does not have the levers to decarbonise as effectively as others. What we're seeing, and what we've seen in other transport sectors such as maritime in the EU, is that direct onboarding into that can have huge price spikes in fuel, and that means that those operators have to effectively either stomach that price themselves or pass it on to their consumers. And what we're concerned about is that this ultimately will limit people's ability to afford to fly, which is crucial for some people for work and for life, and that there isn't a viable alternative available currently, so it is an unfair penalty on the industry. But I think Simon's better positioned to speak on that than me. But we feel that SAF is a key enabler in that in all its forms, but PTL ultimately is the lowest carbon option. And the ETS mechanism has the potential to be able to support and fund some of the technology development and project development that's needed in the industry to help decarbonise.
Has there been then enough alignment between the development of this bill and the policy discussions and decisions that are being made around both the UK ETS and now presumably the Europe ETS as well?
And so this is where the global nature of modern life and modern industries like aviation intersects with, national policy, and there are overarching agreements such as CORSIA, which is a global voluntary scheme currently that allows airlines to attribute carbon reduction and offsetting across the globe. And we think there's a really important interplay around how an international sector such as aviation interacts with those national decarbonisation objectives. I don't have the answers to that, but I think Simon would probably be better positioned to speak on that.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. So if you look at getting to that 2050 target, as an operator, we have sort of 4 tools. One is SAF, one is new technology. We've spoken a lot about those. The third is improvements in operating, so airspace improvements and other ways of reducing direct fuel burn. And the fourth is emissions trading schemes and offsets. So we would see them as
Isn't there a fifth one, which is demand reduction?
There is, you're right, yeah. There is.
Do you see a role in that as
So if you look at all of the pathways, demand reduction is in there. That's the least best, I would say, as an operator, because we don't want to restrict people's ability to fly. And particularly here in Scotland, we were just talking about lifeline routes. That really is, I didn't mention it because it doesn't feature on our radar. It is in some of the pathways. I think SAF and technology are the ones we need to try and increase, and we spoke about trying to increase SAF production for that. Ralph said it as well, emissions trading schemes and the CORSIA, the international scheme, are the sort of third in line with demand reduction last. So we should do our best to develop SAF and new tech, so we don't need ETS schemes, because they're effectively a form of offsetting, not direct offsetting. So they're not as efficient in terms of pure, actual, real decarbonisation as the other tools.
Okay, and then back to my question then about alignment between policy development of ETS and the measures that are in this bill. What does that conversation look like with you as an operator on one side of the table? Is it, does the calculation kind of get discussed around the economic impacts or particular choices, or are they developed in isolation?
I would describe them as parallel streams at the moment that are being used as separate tools. Maybe there's a case for bringing them into more alignment because as the operator, they're a cost of doing business to decarbonise. So if I look at, the cost of abating our emissions, ETS is very much in there as one of our costs of achieving that. Investing in new technology, aircraft's another one, buying SAF. So it does, for an operator, it falls into the same stream. But at the moment, I think as policy tools, they are discussed as separate streams. Okay,
that's useful to know. And then, the modelling that we've had in front of us suggests that, the provisions of the bill add about £1.50 to an average ticket price. Is that your understanding of?
Of the
Of
revenue,
the-
so that
of the
hasn't,
revenue
I mean,
impact.
there's lots of numbers being bandied around. I saw that the aviation minister described it as it wouldn't cost more than a cup of coffee. Well, that's a range.
Half a cup of coffee.
Was it half a cup of coffee?
Depends if it's an airport
Yeah.
coffee. It's
So,
probably...
so I kind of come back, you know, and I sort of come back to the aviation industry, whether we like it or not. It's a very marginal business, very marginal. I've worked in it for 30 years. I love it, but if I was to make a fortune, I probably wouldn't have, you know, chosen it as a business to work in. I work in it because I love aviation. We've published accounts, £4.50 per passenger profit. Most of that we reinvest. So if you put that into perspective, £1.50, if that's the number, it could be more, could have a very detrimental impact to our ability or on our cost base. So I think what we need to do, and that's the key question here, is what is the cost going to be of the revenue certainty mechanism? And that's not clear yet, and that's one of the things in the bill that I think needs to be pinned down a little bit more. And that's driven by the strike price and the levy.
Okay, that again is very useful. As a business that supplies a service to remote and island communities, you know, providing lifeline rural flights, I mean, do you make a distinction between the lifeline flights and the kind of financial measures such as air departure tax that might be attributed to those flights? Do you make a distinction between that and other parts of your business which are, you know, supplying a tourism market, which are supplying economic demand for aviation and routes?
In terms of how you approach sustainability, or?
In terms of your thoughts around pricing, around any aspect.
No, I mean,
do you
at the
see
end
it as
of the day,
all the same kind of?
Yeah, at the end of the day,
business?
we operate a range of routes, and we try and make sure each of those routes is sustainable economically, unless it's supported. And there are some government-supported events. We have the air discount scheme for islanders. So there are government support mechanisms. But ultimately, you know, in our case, Loganair is a commercial company, privately owned, and so we have to deliver some profitability to reinvest in the company. So we look at our whole route network as a whole and try and make sure that it's environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable, and that we continue to deliver those lifeline routes that are so very important. You know, we carry an awful lot of NHS passengers, for example, as you know. So the mail and freight services that we provide to the islanders, that it's a very important thing that not just Loganair, but any regional carrier does. And we are transporting people because they need to travel, not necessarily because they want to travel. And that's a big distinction, I think, between an airline like Loganair and some others.
Yeah. So that distinction between want and need, do you think that's reflected in government policy at the moment, in the Jet Zero strategy? Is there enough of a distinction between lifeline flights, those, as you say, who need... So if we're looking at demand reduction, for example, we acknowledge that is inevitably going to be part of the picture going forward. Is there enough of a distinction between lifeline flights, the need, and those where it might be desirable to have 4 holidays a year, but actually that's probably beyond most people's ability anyway, whereas getting to an NHS appointment, having essential travel is absolutely critical.
When it comes to decarbonising the industry, the discussions around just decarbonising the industry, we don't look at, you know, particular routes and networks. It's the industry as a whole or an airline level. We need to hit those 2050 targets. I think what you're describing is perhaps a different debate about the importance of lifeline routes and how governments support those, and that is worthy of debate. It's not often linked to the sustainability point. However, if we can deliver SAF or we can deliver new technology, we will deliver significant environmental benefits for those lifeline routes as well. And I mentioned that new technology has the potential to move first on shorter flights. So those tend to be the lifeline routes because they're short flights to island communities. So we can get that new tech on it. We'll have sustainability improvements, and we'll also have cost improvements as well. So it just isn't normally debated in the same forums, I think.
Yeah. So just to finalise then, so the costs of SAF, which we're not entirely sure what they'll be, we've got figures of £1.50. You're saying that's hotly debated, but that will be spread out across all of the tickets, all of the seats that you're selling. There won't be a focus on any particular, you know, flights that may or may use more or less SAF than others.
No, and I
Okay.
think so. That number you're talking about is the levy, I think, on the revenue certainty mechanism. SAF itself, the cost of the SAF is a different question.
Yeah.
As I said, at the moment for us, it's 3 times the cost of Jet A1. And if you look at industry figures, IATA has been mentioned a lot, of very good reference for industry data. They're talking at between 3 and 5 times more expensive. That depends on buying power as well. We're a relatively small airline. So if we go to a fuel producer and say we want a certain amount of SAF, we have less buying power than a very big network carrier, you know, KLMs or Lufthansas of this world. And that is a factor that will drive the cost of SAF, as well as the levy in the revenue certainty mechanism.
Okay. Okay, that's all useful. Thanks.
Okay, so I've got a very simple question, and I'm going to ask you to prioritise the 2 biggest threats to the production of SAF. I don't need the reasons because I think you've had a chance to explain them. Which do you think are the 2 biggest threats to the increase in the production of SAF? And I'm going to come to you first, Doug, followed by Simon, followed by Ralph.
I would say that government policy doesn't understand the importance that kickstarting SAF could have for the power to liquids in terms of kickstarting economic growth for the country.
Okay.
That's the most important thing. So it's around government policy. And the second is the 2 things.
2?
Second, yeah, so that's the first one, getting government policy right. And then the second one would be ensuring that we attract we get everybody around the table and make sure that all the stakeholders involved in making that work are actually engaged, because
So lack of coordinated investment.
Lack of coordinated investment, yes.
Trying to keep it simple and
that's
short.
it.
It works for me. Simon?
Yeah, I think it broadly similar, but I will say it is, I think, is making sure there's enough private capital out there that wants to invest in SAF, and making sure that they're not going to invest in some other industry, number 1. And number 2, making sure that the government policy ensures that private capital invests in SAF and not in something else. So the 2 are linked, I think, but those are the 2 most important things for me.
Ralph, of course you have the option of agreeing with Doug or Simon or coming up with 2 others. Which would you like to do?
For me, it's policy and crowding in investment are the 2 biggest threats.
That's it. That's interesting because price seems to have been dropped as a priority.
If we solve those first 2, the price should drop.
Perfect, understood. Sarah, you get a very brief question at the end on I think, unless you feel it's already been answered.
No, I think it's been answered.
Okay.
I think it's just not just passing this piece of legislation, but it's all the action points that are needed afterwards to actually make it work for everybody and reduce emissions and invest in our economy and join up the dots. Yep.
So thank you very much for coming and giving evidence this morning. I'm sorry the evidence session ran on a bit, but that happens when it's a subject which enthuses committee members. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for your time. And I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to change over. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome back to the meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Item 3 is consideration of 2 draft statutory instruments, the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 and the Equality Act 2010 Specification of Public Authority Scotland Order 2025. These instruments confer responsibilities on Zero Waste Scotland in relation to the public sector equality duty in the Equality Act 2010. This follows Zero Waste Scotland's reclassification as a non-departmental public body in October 2024. The instrument aims to align its legal responsibility with that status. The DPLR committee has raised no points in relation to either instrument, and I welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, and her supporting officials for these items. And they are Andrew Mackay, the Head of Environment and Forestry Sponsorship Hub, Caroline Boyd, a lawyer, and Russell Bain, the Deputy Director for International Futures and Brand Scotland Policy Scottish Government. These instruments are laid under the affirmative procedure, which means they cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves them. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider 2 motions recommending that the instruments be approved. And I'll remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not under the, but not in the debate that follows. Now, Cabinet Secretary, I think you want to make a short opening statement.
I'm pleased to speak in support of 2 draft instruments that laid before Parliament last month, the Equality Act 2010 Specifications of Public Authorities Scotland Order 2025 and the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025. These are technical in nature, but they are nonetheless important measures that reinforce our commitment to equality and inclusion across Scotland's public sector. They ensure that Zero Waste Scotland, following its transition to a non-departmental public body in October of last year, is now subject to the same statutory equality obligations as other public authorities. The schedule of the Circular Economy Act applied the majority of public sector duties to Zero Waste Scotland, such as those in the Freedom of Information Scotland Act and the Public Appointments and Public Bodies Scotland Act. However, making Zero Waste Scotland subject to the public sector equality duty under the 2010 Act and the related duties under the 2025 regulations has to be done separately by way of an SSI, given the terms of the 2010 Act. The first instrument formally designates Zero Waste Scotland as a public authority under Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010. This means that the organisation must now comply with the public sector equality duty, which requires public bodies to consider how their policies and practices affect people with protected characteristics. This duty is central to promoting fairness, dignity and inclusion in the delivery of public services. And the second instrument applies the specific duties set out in the Equality Act 2010, Regulations 2012. These duties are designated to support public authorities in meeting the public sector equality duty in a transparent and accountable way. And this includes the collection and publication of workforce diversity data, the setting of equality outcomes and regular reporting and progress against those outcomes. These measures are not only about compliance, they are about embedding equality into the culture and operations of public bodies. They help ensure that decisions are informed by evidence, that services are responsive to the needs of all communities, and that public bodies are held to account for their performance on equality. Zero Waste Scotland employs around 160 staff, plays a central role in delivering Scotland's circular economy strategy, and in doing so it's helping to reduce waste, promote resource efficiency and drive sustainable economic growth by keeping materials in use for as long as possible. It will be an integral part of the Scottish Government's aim to reach net zero by 2045. So it's right, therefore, we extend these duties to the organisation, which will strengthen our objective to ensure that our public services are representative of the people of Scotland. I recommend these instruments to the committee and to Parliament as necessary and proportionate steps to uphold equality standards across the whole of Scotland's public sector. Convener.
Thank you, Gillian. Does any member have any questions or on these instruments? No. Okay, so We'll then move on to agenda item 4. Agenda item 4 is a debate on the motion S6M 18943, calling on for the committee to recommend approval of the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025. Cabinet Secretary, do you want to speak to and move this motion?
I'll move the motion. I think I've
Thank
said
you.
enough.
Now I would invite any members who wish to contribute. Does anyone wish to contribute? No one does. So, Cabinet Secretary, I don't believe you'll have much to sum up on, but you can sum up and respond if you like.
No, thank you.
Thank you. So the question is that motion S6M 18943 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I would invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve the draft of the report for publication. Are you happy to do so? We are agreed. We'll now move on to agenda item 5, which is a debate on motion S6M 18944, calling for the committee to recommend approval of the Quality Act 2010 specification of Public Authorities Scotland Order 2025. Cabinet Secretary asks you to move this motion and speak to it if you so desire.
I'll move the motion.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Now move to members to see if anyone would like to contribute. No one does. Cabinet Secretary, do you wish to sum up in any way?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Therefore, the question is motion S6M 18944 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Therefore, I would seek the committee approval because we will have to report on the outcome of this instrument in due course. And I suggest that we can both these instruments we've considered today are reported on in a single report, given they're so closely related, and that the committee delegate authority to me as convener to approve the draft of that report for publication. Are you happy to do so? Thank you, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and for your officials for turning up this morning to give evidence on these motions, and we'll now move into private. Thank you.
Thank you, convener.